Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be with you today on such an auspicious and historic day. For those of you who don't know Stakeholder Forum, we are an international NGO. We've been around for quite a while, 28 years. Our job, our mission, is to advance sustainable development, which we do through governance, participatory decision-making, and stakeholder engagement at all levels, but primarily focusing on these international intergovernmental processes. I always very much like being on the same panel as Nick Hill, because he really quells my civil society angst about some of these things. He's very reassuring that everything will be okay, and Farooq, don't worry, it's going to be fine. However, my job is to be provocative, and so whilst I share fully my colleagues' enthusiasm that 2015 is indeed, has the potential at least, to be a major milestone in humanity's future, there are some tensions and challenges that we still really need to deal with. And my job is to highlight those. So please don't take this as an entirely negative presentation. I think this is a huge achievement so far, but we need to see it through and not let ourselves be caught up at the finish line. So I think it's first maybe worthwhile just talking about some fundamental differences between the MDGs and the SDGs, just a bit of a scene-setting thing. This shift has really signified a shift from economic growth to sustainable development as the answer to the poverty problem. Whilst it's still very much political rhetoric, and as Tara's pointed out, we need now to sort of shift application. That is hugely politically significant. This is something that we really need to take advantage of and use to our own benefit of our work. The SDGs, of course, have a greater focus on the root causes of poverty, as Nick Hill has identified, issues around environmental degradation, inequalities, and or lack of governance issues. And specifically, as we've mentioned throughout the conference so far, whilst the MDGs were primarily applied to developing countries only, the SDGs are global in nature and universal in application. And I'll come back to this point of universality, and it's very, very important that we need to understand what that really means in practice. So, some tensions within the SDG framework, and again, this is, it is a huge success even to get to this point. And what we have is representative of a long process, but also a great deal of intellectual input. However, there are still some challenges that we need to look at and overcome, including, of course, the first one, which is within the framework itself, this tension between short-term poverty alleviation and long-term poverty eradication. It's been a bit of a problem, and this agenda represents the convergence of the MDG, the post-2015 development agenda stuff, and the Rio +20 sustainable development goals type things. And these are very, very different communities, essentially the development community and the environment sustainable development community. And you can't exactly tell somebody who's living in grinding poverty now, don't worry, we're dealing with the structural causes of your poverty, come back to us in 15 years when we complete the SDG framework, and you'll all be fine. And so there is a need for a bit of empathy and compassion within this. We need to understand how these goals really play out in terms of actually helping people on the ground, which is exactly what sustainable development is all about. And so that tension really needs to be considered in terms of the fact that you can't just wait till the 14th year, deliver your SDGs, and presume that you're doing sustainable development. It simply does not work that way. There is also a risk of policy incoherence within the framework. For example, there are some potentials for goals to compete or even conflict. We have a goal on economic growth, but we have a goal on sustainable consumption and production. This is a perennial problem in sustainable development, dating back to the Club of Rome and understanding limits of growth. And I don't think that we've really squared this particular circle. How do we do economic growth of the traditional type and SCP at the same time, or can we find a way to make these things compatible with one another? And can we achieve this idea of economic decoupling? So these are some issues that, there's other things in there. We need to look at them. As Nick Hill pointed out as well, it's a very, very large and very broad agenda, which is good. I mean, we said it already, sustainable development is about everything. But how then do you communicate these things? Will children understand these things? Will it be something that we can use to actually help not only deliver a greater common inheritance for future generations, but also educate people about the importance of sustainable development and what it means? The number of goals remains slightly contentious, but it's not going to change now. So we have 17 goals, as Nick Hill said, 169 targets. This is a big policy challenge in terms of delivery, and we need to think very carefully about, with scarce resources, how you do that. The last point in terms of some of these tensions is there is a very big difference between means of implementation, or MOI, and actual implementation. And the outcome document in September 2015 will paint some very good broad brushstrokes about how we're going to implement things, but then actually doing it will be a much, much longer process, and it'll probably take the first 5 years of the framework from the 1st of January 2016 to really figure out some of these detailed issues about how the mechanics of implementation will work, how do we set up institutions and decision making at the regional, national, subnational, and even local levels. So it's not exactly that we will just hit the ground running from the 1st of January and delivery will happen all at once. This is a very unique moment in time. Nobody's attempted these types of things at this scale before, so it is a learning process, and these things will have to be sort of tried and figured out as we go along. I mentioned MOI, means of implementation. Within that, of course, there are some things, and I want to highlight, I think I have 12 different challenges of MOI and things that we need to deal with, and it should cut across to this idea of institutions and long-termism as well. The first is, we talk about universality a lot as a principle, as a concept. We throw around the term very loosely, I think, but it remains largely very undefined, and despite there being an increasing number of reports on the subject, there is no really specific common definition about what that means. How universal does the framework have to be? I mean, we know it's not going to apply equally to developed and developing countries, but 80% is, if the framework's 80% universal, is that good enough? 70%? If it's less than 50%, can we consider it a universal framework in terms of relevance to all countries? I think these issues really still need to be discussed and fleshed out. And whilst the second issue is around this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities that Tara has raised in the climate discussions, and whilst the principle is fundamental to sustainable development, I believe it comes from Principle 7 of the Rio 92 principles, the practice of CBR quite often can be hijacked and used to hold developed countries hostage. We've seen it in the climate discussions, it's become a barrier, and that's very sad because the truth of CBDR is it very clearly states that we have common but differentiated responsibilities. Everybody would sign up to that. But the practice can mean something very different. And so we really have to understand how we're going to deal with CBDR, and these two concepts of universality and CBDR then become related to one another. Universality is essentially a pact between all countries that everybody must do their bit. This idea of conditionality based on overseas development aid is a dated concept. There's something much new in this. And again, Nick Hill said this very clearly, no country has achieved this agenda yet. So we're all in it together. Of course, the other challenge is to try to find innovative sources of financing beyond traditional overseas development aid. It's very clear that that amount of money will be completely insufficient to deliver on the Sustainable Development Challenge. So how do we mobilize domestic resources? How do we look at incentivizing capital markets and private flows of income to deliver on the SDGs? And particularly when it comes to capital markets, how do we not only start to put some funding towards that, but the majority of the capital markets that we work on right now goes towards unsustainable activities. So if only a proportion is going there, we have to deal with all of this other big trillion-pound, trillion-dollar industry, which is actually still doing very unsustainable things. Technological transfer remains sometimes contentious and at odds with property rights, and of course the profit incentive. A lot of these technologies are developed by private sector companies, and they're not simply willing to just give them to anybody who wants to use them for the greater good. And so these issues will have to be addressed as well. We've talked about the fact that the SDGs will not be legally binding. So therefore, how do we do accountability, and where is the enforcement? If a country simply fails to meet all of the SDGs, what are the consequences? The number 6 challenge I want to highlight is that science is often overlooked in implementation. We've talked about this in some of the working groups already. There is a very strong need when we come to deliver on sustainable development to drive this delivery through evidence-based decision-making. And science, of course, I believe, is the best, most neutral and independent source of information about what we need to do that we have available, and we need to start using it better. We've talked about data as well. We have a very big, massive data challenge. We simply don't have all of the data available for the SDGs, and we will have to build up that framework over time. I believe there was a report from Australia, from the statistical office there, a couple of years ago now, saying that they felt they had about 50 to 60% of the required information. This is Australia, which I presume is very well prepared for these types of issues compared to, say, other countries in the world. And we have to think about how are we going to do this. This is a 15-year framework. We can't spend the first 10 to 12 years just simply thinking about how we will measure these things. Governance arrangements, particularly at the local and national levels, need to be strengthened for these things. Quite often there's a number of bodies working on these issues, but interestingly, how do we look at the interconnections between, say, national parliaments and audit offices and executive offices of government? I talked a bit about policy and coherence already. This concept of partnership is also something that gets used very often, but we haven't really articulated very clearly what do these new global partnerships really mean in action and how do we use them. And despite the great improvements in terms of stakeholder engagement and participation in the post-2015 process itself, which has been very, very open and very inclusive, true participation at all levels remains not truly fulfilled and realized, and we have to get better at how will stakeholders be a part of the challenge of delivery and making decisions about how sustainable development will work at all national levels. And Wales, of course, presents us a very good example of how to do it well. And lastly, as I mentioned, there's this tension between MOI and actual implementation. We need very strong implementation plans. I'm delighted to hear from Nikhil that so many different countries around the world are beginning to look at this. It's very encouraging. Universality, I want to spend some time on this. Stakeholder Forum is undertaking a study at the moment trying to understand what universality means. We've come up with a triangle, and for those of you who were in my workshop yesterday, you know I have a thing for triangles. So we have undertaken a study which develops a methodology trying to understand what universality means in practical terms and the implications of it for developed countries. So we've come up with 3 criteria around applicability, implementability, and transformationalism. And we've gone off and scored each one of the targets and goals within the framework against these 3 criteria. And what it came back to tell us is that whilst we've used the UK as a bit of a proxy, that the goals, you can't really see this very well, I'm sorry for that, we have a certain different prioritization of what the goals are. And our scoring, actually taking the UK as a proxy for this, said that the most important SDG in terms of emphasis for action then becomes the climate change goal. The third is energy for all, and the second is energy for all, and the third is SCP, sustainable consumption and production. And what this is trying to tell us is that whilst you cannot simply pick or choose which SDGs you choose to work on, everybody has a responsibility to work on them all, there might be a different emphasis for action at that national level. And we need countries to really think carefully about how they're going to do this and where they will put their emphasis in terms of delivery. And ultimately what we found out and what this led us to believe is that universality is also the quest for transformationalism. And how can each country play its part to drive a truly global and transformative agenda for sustainable development. And these types of studies, we believe, will start helping people understand where they can actually truly add most value. So this study hopefully will be out in the next couple of weeks, and we are thinking, Derek and I are thinking about the next steps now, including updating our triangle and taking it to the next level. So please look for that. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on some issues around SD governance. How am I doing for time? 2 minutes, okay. So we do need to look at how we've talked about this at length today, and yesterday, about looking at the government and legislative machinery for sustainable development. Again, Wales provides a very good example that others can pick up, but there are many, and we cannot be prescriptive about how to deliver on these things. Including, of course, thinking about this new forum, the high-level political forum in the UN system, and how that can be crucial as an apex mechanism in terms of understanding progress and aggregating all of these sort of data measurements from around the world, and then truly assessing whether we're on course to meet the goals that we've set for ourselves. But also understanding the interconnections between these levels is vital. We really need an improved sense of the big picture of governance and how the machine works together. And not trying to do this at very separate, disaggregated levels or disaggregated silos, but having a true sense of the governance constellation, as I call it, and how it all fits together will be essential. There is a need for, potentially, before Tara slaps me on the wrist, new sustainable development strategies at the national levels or other policy-making frameworks. How do we translate these SDGs into these things? For example, the UK at the moment does not have a national sustainable development strategy. Do we feel that's a good idea? It's debatable. Again, Wales provides a very good example for how these SDGs could be translated into the national context. We need to, of course, continue to work on ever greater participation and inclusion of stakeholders in these processes. We're making good headway, but that does not mean by any means that this is a done deal. And of course, in some parts of the world, it's very, very poor, and it's essential to the delivery of sustainable development that we have full inclusion of all stakeholders. We need to look at how we improve formal and informal capacity building and educational programs. That is essential in terms of this delivery. Governments will not be able to deliver on this agenda alone. We need all actors from all parts of society. And lastly, we need to address this inherent tension between long-term decision-making and electoral cycles in democracies. This is, of course, part and parcel of exactly the reason we're here. How do we, in a full-blown democracy, allow our elected representatives to make decisions for the long term? Right now, I believe we're incentivized for them to make decisions in which they will see results within the electoral cycles. And that, of course, hamstrings us, and it becomes a tension between democracy and sustainable development. And these two things cannot be at odds with one another. They are, of course, part and parcel of the same thing. We need to, again, square this circle and figure out an answer. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.